the A541E transmission in the Toyota Camry. This one's a 94. This is like the debut year of the 1MZ FE.
It is, yes.
V6. So this is like the first year. This car is an import from Japan. So there's quite a bit of information that we found not listed in the service manual from Toyota itself, and from experience from digging around through the car and going through the wiring, etc. Number one, one of the most confusing things is whether this car classifies as an OB1 or an OB2 for a scan tool. Our biggest problem was none of the yahoos at the auto parts store or any other person with a scanner, with an OB2 scanner or an OB1 scanner, could scan this car. And I'll tell you why real quick. They couldn't scan this car when we were having transmission trouble, and we were having the check engine light on, and we were having the OD light flashing, and this car would take off basically in third gear, which had no acceleration upon takeoff. So it was essentially taking off in third gear, and then overdrive would work. So the only two gears that were working on this car was third gear and overdrive. That's when you put it in drive. Now when we manually shifted it, we bypassed. This transmission's fully electronic other than the manual shift. So when we bypass it and put it down in L, of course we're going in first, second, and then third. Now we did find a problem between shifting between first and third. The car seemed to want to jump from, with our previous problem, wanted to jump from first to third when we manually shifted it. It's still better than taking off in third gear so you don't burn up your clutches. But let me go back to explaining getting the car, getting a proper code for it. The OB port under the hood, the under the hood port is
right on the intake.
Yeah, right on the intake for the OB1, or for the bypass, the diagnostics box under the hood is basically almost useless on this car. Even, I guess maybe it was left there for the 4 cylinders. There's probably some things that we haven't encountered yet that we can use that box to test, because there are some wires going to it. It seems to be active in some way, but you can't use the normal procedure that they tell you to do on the OB1 car.
Check your codes, yeah.
To check your codes. So we found an OB2 port behind this little change drawer, which is right here. There's your OB2 port, hidden behind that little change drawer in your fuse panel.
Anyone with the V6 in this year model has that.
Right. So the 94 has that. The problem is when you get to the auto parts store and you tell them a 1994 XLE or whatever with a V6, their scan tool doesn't go back to 94.
It goes to 96, the latest.
It goes 90. It says 95, but it doesn't pull up a Camry for 95 on their scan tools. So to get an accurate scan on this car, you have to tell them it's a 96, and then they can plug into this port here and perform the normal diagnostic procedure on the scan tool, on the OB2 port, on the OB2 tool, scan tool. So that's, first of all, I'd pull the codes and find out, hey, what's going on the OB2 port. So that's how to get this car diagnosed, this 94, since it's on the cusp of OB1, OB2, and it's advanced ahead of its time. So that throws a lot of mechanics and people for a loop who work on this car. It threw me for a loop. Another thing we found is there's a big problem with the wires that go to, especially since it's so old, and the wires get brittle. There's a wiring harness on the transmission itself, and if it weren't raining its ass off right now, I'd go outside and show you under the hood. There's a wire that comes from the transmission across the top of the transmission. It's part of the wiring harness and it crosses over the top of the transmission, drops down underneath the battery tray, and connects to the main port for the shift solenoids, which is a couple of wires. I have another video with the shift solenoid wires.
It's like a big square.
Yeah, as it's a small square. Well, there's a rectangular square that plug itself goes into the shift. I'm sorry, I forgot what it was. It goes into the shift.
The neutral position switch?
Yes, neutral positioning sensor switch or shift selector switch. That we found was a problem on this car as well. We found that we were doing all the necessary testing on the shift 1 and 2 solenoid wires. We were honing it back to the computer. The computer was sending out 9 volts to those sensors.
More than that, I was sending out 10.
10 volts, something like that. And that was enough for it to tell the transmission to shift. However, we had what's called a weak signal. So essentially we had a wire that was, or several wires that were partially severed on the wiring harness that were going down underneath the battery.
I haven't located them yet.
No, we haven't located their exact location, but I know within 2 feet, wrapped up in a jacket, where they are. We just have them to the point where they're not shorting out against each other, because that was the case with us. They were shorting out, and one of them had weak continuity. So even though it had the voltage with a voltmeter, it didn't have the appropriate amperage to tell this car to shift gears. So we were reading correctly on one plug, but we didn't have enough voltage to shift gears. Also, that plug for the neutral park positioning sensor, the same thing that the downshift cable is attached to, and the shifting linkage on the side of the transmission in the front under the battery tray. That's a pain in the butt to get to. It was dropping. We found out because when we unplugged it, it was dropping power right there. So that winded up being part of the reason why we lost shift solenoid A or B. We don't know which one we lost or that was giving us a problem. Actually, to be honest, we don't even know if we lost those 2 shift solenoids. We don't know if the Densos that were in there, or whatever brand that were in there, we don't know if they were actually working properly or not. When we took them out and battery tested them, they worked fine. When we stuck them to a 12-volt battery, that means they had the proper amperage. It doesn't mean that once they're in the car and the wiring harness is going to them that they have the proper amperage. They could have the proper voltage, but not the proper amperage. And it's really hard to do a load test on those things when you don't have something to test the amperage. You could open the hood and ride on the hood of the car and test it while a friend's driving it, but I wouldn't recommend that. I mean, I don't see any other way to do it other than to do some kind of load test on those circuits.
That was PO 753. That was our code.
Yeah.
Shift solenoid A, electrical malfunction.
Right. And so a electrical malfunction could have meant the solenoid was bad internally, or there was a wiring harness issue. Well, turns out we don't know whether it was the solenoid or the wiring harness issue. All we know is that we kind of fixed both problems at the same time. So we don't know. We just know that the car is running great and shifting great. Even I think up to 136 miles an hour so far. So a long story short, check the wiring harness that goes across the top of the transmission. It loops through a metal hook or a metal one-hole strap on the top of the transmission, and that wiring harness itself traces all the way back under the dashboard to the computer. We've even pulled that computer out. We've experimented and changed that computer already, and we seem to have a better running car with that computer than we did with the other computer that was in it. And we found out in the past, whoever owned this car changed the computer as well, which was kind of crazy. It wasn't the original computer. We saw a junkyard part writing numbers on it, ink from a junkyard. So we ordered a computer off of eBay. There's only one set of numbers that need to match on that computer. It's not the long number at the bottom. It's the number that's highlighted in black, outlined in black, and it needs to be the V6. So it's not the serial number that needs to be matched. It's actually the part number for the computer.
This is actually an LE computer. We have an XLE Camry, and they seem to work just fine. All the functions seem to work.
Everything works great. It works fine. So, you know, we have an extra computer, you know, that still works. One's more sensitive to a check engine light than another, which tells me, you know, that Toyota has computer problems, especially in older models like this. So we found that we can't reprogram these computers. All we can do is reset them with the fuse back to the ECT. I mean, remove the fuse and reset them back to the factory default settings. So in hindsight, you're kind of stuck with whatever Toyota gave you as far as computer programming. We couldn't get a laptop out here to plug in and you know, set some shift points and all that on the computer. So we couldn't do the fast and the furious on this Toyota unless we got an aftermarket computer or something that was, you know, and we're not interested in that. We're just trying to keep a stock vehicle that runs good. But anyway, the point is that this is a little description of what problems this year model Toyota Camry has, and I'm sure a couple of other year models have this kind of same problem. And it's important to note that Toyota is so finicky on check engine lights. It should be the #1 meme on social media when you refer to what car has what problem. Toyota, check engine light. Every time. It doesn't matter what happens. The slightest detection, check engine light. And as soon as it triggers a check engine light, the computer goes into all kinds of compensation techniques where it tries to overcompensate for this or that.
And don't forget limp mode either.
Right.
If a transmission problem is detected, it will go into a limp mode.
Right, which will limit your speed. It will limit your RPM. It will limit your speed. Or maybe it's just your mile per hour, but not your RPM. But it will limit you. So that's another thing to consider. That's a possibility that your vehicle's going into limp mode. It's wiring harness related. It's, you know, I don't know. A lot of these Toyota transmissions are very tough. They're tougher. These transmissions are tougher than I thought they were. Let me just note something about trying to diagnose bad clutches in a transmission. From my experience of, I don't know, owning 50-something cars in my lifetime and working on, I can't remember how many for other people. The RPM gauge, if at any point in time the transmission in any gear, in drive, or through any gear, reverse, anything, the RPM gauge free zings up, zing, zing, like it doesn't have a load, that's an indicator that you got some clutch slippage issues, or some kind of broken hard part inside the transmission. If you get any of that and you have no resistance, or, you know, I expect if you try to take off in third gear and you're giving it some gas to take off forward, I expect the problem I expect the transmission to have some slippage to it. The transmission can't handle, I mean, the vehicle can't handle weight versus speed ratio, etc. Can't handle taking off in third gear, and that's kind of self-explanatory, but I'm just going over it anyway because there's some people that don't, you know, they don't have any, you know, experience with that. But at any point in time, you can get your transmission clutches to break free by throttling, and you can feel it disengage when you give it a lot of gas. You're either A, low on transmission fluid, B, you have a clogged filter, or there's some kind of obstruction in the valve body, or something like that, or your clutches are bad. all of these things are indicators that you kind of have to go deeper into the transmission or go into a rebuild or a replacement. But if it's just zinging up a little bit and you're getting some resistance and the car's still moving forward, the mile per hour is still climbing, yeah, you're probably stressing or glazing the clutches, you know, putting some scorch marks on them, but it doesn't necessarily mean you can't get some more mileage out of the transmission. It just means that, you know, you're stressing the crap out of it. So with that said, pull the code first, find out what code it is, and if it winds up being the same code that I had, if it's a shift solenoid,
A or B,
or something like that, then check that wiring harness. Please check that wiring harness.
You want to show them right now? The rain kind of got down.
Yeah, let me chill.
There we go. Before the rain picks up.
Now it just started raining again. Alright, so right underneath here, this wiring harness, let's show the wiring harness here. Okay, here's the wiring harness off the top of the transmission. Kind of goes around here, goes to this clip. It wasn't a metal clip, I was wrong. Those wires right there go underneath the transmission and they go down. And right there, see if you can get a good view down here.
Yeah, let me see if I can get it from here.
No, look. There's a plug right there.
That's it, yeah, that's the solenoid plug.
Okay, that's a solenoid plug. That's a square plug. And earlier I said a square rectangular. Nobody make fun of me for that, because you don't. That's just a slip of words. Let me see if I can get the phone down in here. I hate using these phones. That plug right there.
It is a big rectangular one.
Yeah, that plug down there underneath the battery tray is the one that was giving us problems. The plug itself was full of corrosion, plus somebody in the past had packed it with some kind of funky grease.
White lithium grease,
I think they used white lithium grease.
It gunked up.
And it kind of solidified, and that was causing a problem. So I kind of closed the pins on some of that plug and made a better connection that gave us some more amperage. And you know, these solenoids take a great deal of amperage to activate. So that's another problem. If there's a drop in amperage somewhere from the alternator or from the battery, this car won't shift right. And we found that out too. And like I said, somewhere in this little short piece of wiring right here, where all these purple wires and red wires go through here, and I said 2-foot section before, scratch that. This is only about a 1-foot section between here and there. There's a problem with wires that have, you know, they're skinned somewhere, or there's some problem. And so far we have the harness in a position and the wire in a position where it's not causing a shift problem. So I hope this kind of explains a little bit about this engine and this Toyota, this particular year model for the 90s, if there are any more still out there on the road. And apparently they are, because we're getting some views on our transmission video. And wait, here's that useless diagnostic port that the manual tells you to try to use, and other people in videos try to tell you to use, but it's useless with the V6. It's only good for the 4-cylinder. Okay, I hope this helps. If there's any more questions, just send them at me.